We are the Jim-Ree African American Museum of Northeast Georgia. And today we will be sharing with you our keynote speaker, Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker. Many of you will know of her by her reputation. She is a professor at Emory University, and she's the author of The Lost Education of Horace Tate, among others, a Juneteenth celebration with Jim-Ree Museum. I'll be your host today. I'm April Ham, and now Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for the opportunity to join you in Elberton, even if I'm doing it via Zoom. I actually have really wonderful memories of the times I spent in Elberton doing the research for what would become the Lost Education of Horace Tate. I remember that I was always warmly welcomed by everyone. The gentleman who at the time was leading the school board, the people at archival sites, in stores, and even when I was just out and about in the community and visiting the Blackwell School. So it's my honor to be invited to return to you for the celebration, again, even if it's virtual. So thanks to you, April, and to Mr. White, and to others who supported this invitation. Dr. Horace Edward Tate, born in Elberton, Georgia. I had the opportunity to spend 2 years with him in the last 2 years of his life. I was present at his home typically 2 or 3 times a week for most of those weeks. And then I spent another 16 years after his death tracing the story that he initially shared with me verbally. In the last weeks before his death, Dr. Tate would actually frequently say to me, "Have you been back down to the building?" He's referring to the building that the Black teachers had owned back during segregation when he was the executive secretary of the Black Teachers Association. I had initially met him at the building, and as far as I was concerned, we had seen everything at the building, right? I'd been in his office, I'd been in closets. I thought he had shown me everything. But this man, who over the 2 years that I was in his home gradually unveiled more and more materials, actually was referring to something different, something that I did not understand at that time. I'm ashamed to say I would not actually go back to the building until after he died. I assured him I would go, but I didn't actually go until after his funeral. When I did, following a circuitous route, which I describe in the book and in other places, I discovered what Dr. Tate had hidden: an institutional history of Black educators and our advocacy to help Black children over time. It was a stunning revelation, particularly to recognize that he had directed me to this spot before his death. It brought for me a sense of responsibility, that if he could save these materials at a time when the records of Black educators and Black schools were being destroyed. I talked to his counterpart in North Carolina, and the executive secretary of the former Black Teachers Association there told me himself that when he returned to his own office the day after desegregation, his materials had been burned. And so at a time when our history was being intentionally destroyed, and there's more to that story, Dr. Tate preserved the records. And because he preserved the records, he's been able to rewrite, through the lost education of Horace Tate, another history, one that most of us, despite having been trained in so-called elite schools, have not been taught. So on this day, you think about Dr. Tate as the hometown boy who did well, and you take this moment to celebrate him, and well, you should. He was not just the executive secretary of the Black Teachers Association in Georgia, but of course would go on to become a Georgia senator. He traveled the world. I still laugh about him in London, out in the section where Black people live, trying to organize everybody. There are photos of him with presidents, when I was at the Carter Center a number of years ago now, actually, a number of years ago, because it was before his death. President Carter turned around as we were together in the cafeteria line and said, I hear you writing about my good friend Horace Tate. I think it was the first clue that I had that Dr. Tate was really gifting me something very special. Dr. Tate was the education advisor for Martin Luther King. He was in the White House the day President Kennedy left for Dallas and would be killed. So when you claim him as your own and you want to celebrate it, well, you should. You have every reason to celebrate the hometown boy. But I came to know him both in his life and through his records and his death. I came to know him as more. I could situate him in Elberton because you all were so kind to let me come and visit Elberton and get a sense of the place in which he was born and educated. And that certainly helped with the writing. But Dr. Tate is now in schools of education around the country. And he is reconstructing our understanding of history. And so it's in this space of the Dr. Tate who is being talked about in literally schools of education from Berkeley to the East Coast Teachers College and other places. It's that Dr. Tate that I want to bring back to Elberton today and use to help us think about how he might direct us if he were here. I want to use the frame for this talk from the person who was the president at Fort Valley just before he left Elberton to go attend as a student. Mr. Henry Hunt was a masterful educator and organizer, and that's another story. But Mr. Hunt said something that influenced actually Dr. Tate's education greatly. And I think it's the frame that explains the two pieces I want to share with you today about Dr. Tate that I think matter for us. Dr. Tate said in 1923, 6 years before Dr. Tate was born, that at Fort Valley, they did not teach history as a dead subject, as something from a remote past, but that they taught it as a continuous movement and development. And he said, the past is made to live in the present. That's the way I want to frame Dr. Tate today. I think his past is significant because, yes, it's rewriting our understanding of history. But I think Dr. Tate's past also speaks very deeply to our present and what our generation needs to be thinking about and doing. So if you will, I'd like to offer 2 points. Now, Dr. Tate did a lot of things, and there are a number of points from lost education that we could talk about, but I just want to talk about 2 of them very briefly today. The first is Black children in schools. Now, if we think about that in the present, I think most of us would agree that we know something's wrong. We talk about it. We talk about it at church. We talk about it, our meetings with our neighbors, across the fence, walking. We know that something's wrong. And we know that the problem is not that our children are dumb. They're not. They're smart. They're creative. They make us laugh. They come here with possibilities for life. And then something happens. If we were to look at test scores, they're behind on almost every measurable variable. If we were to look at school desegregation and look at the work of some of my colleagues, we know that America is fast resegregating. Something's not going right with what's happening with our children. The Brown case that was supposed to be victorious and that we love to still celebrate is actually turning sour. If we were to make the past live in the present, does Dr. Tate have anything to say about that? I'm going to suggest the answer is yes. 1970, just as the schools were desegregating, and Dr. Tate was still the president of all of, not president, executive secretary of all of these. Mr. Halls, another one of your Elberton sons, served as a GT and EA president, but that's an aside. During the time that Dr. Tate was executive secretary, and the country is applauding for the desegregation that's happening in the South, Dr. Tate said something very interesting at the last meeting of these Black educators. And he said, it's a second-class integration. Second class. He said, no, I've lived in segregation all my life and I've detested it. But in seeking to obtain integration, we must never accept a second-class integration, because a second-class integration is evil, no matter who says otherwise. Now, Dr. Tate's words in 1970 didn't necessarily go over so well. The public script that historians would write, and that is often still embraced, was that desegregation was the best thing that had happened for Black children. Nothing good really happened for them until we desegregated them in 1970. And that Black teachers, well, they were just afraid of losing their jobs. You know, they were worthless citizens. So wrote an editor in South Carolina. And so when Dr. Tate comes along and says, this is a second-class integration, you all are putting in place. And it's actually not going to work for Black children over time. That's what he said. What was he telling us? That we didn't have ears to hear in that particular time. But Dr. Tate was on the ground. He was a part of the work of these Black educators who were behind the Brown v. Board of Education case, and also the New Kent County case in 1968 that would force the massive desegregation that we'd get in 1970. These Black educators were the ones who paid for the cases. They sacrificed their jobs. I mean, Dr. Tate lost his. They were the ones who had the vision for what Black children needed. And Dr. Tate is on the ground in 1970, and he's cautioning us about something we can't hear. What is he saying? Now, I've talked about this at length, so I want to summarize it very briefly here. But here's what he's trying to get us to understand as the Black community. These Black educators who pushed for the desegregation, sacrificed for the desegregation, had an additive vision for what integration should look like. Now, by additive vision, what they meant was, we'll have all the things we've already created for our children during segregation, and we will add to it something else. That's what our children need. So what did they already have, right? They'd already figured out how to create school climates that would inspire children to achieve, where children would aspire to be full participants in the American democracy. Blackwell School did that, as did Black schools across the South. So this ability for teachers and principals to convince Black children that they were more than what the larger society told them they were, and teach them that they could be anything they wanted to be, was a masterful, pedagogical, visionary tactic that was spread throughout our Black schools. This ability to teach children to aspire. It didn't mean they didn't teach the curriculum. They did teach the curriculum, but they added to the curriculum the notion of aspiration, the care ethic, right? They created a climate where children could succeed. So Black educators already had and understood how to build school climates. Black educators also understood how to advocate. They knew how to work with the communities and get what the children needed, whether it was school bus transportation or a longer school term or better teacher salaries. They knew they were connected with the Black community, and they understood how to work in tandem with the community to have advocacy that will serve the needs of Black children. So when these Black educators talked about an additive model for school integration, which is what they wanted, when they talked about this additive model, for them, the children will still be in climates where they can aspire, and we will still have community connectedness that allows us to advocate and make sure the children have all they need. So what is it that they wanted in integration? Access. They wanted the facilities and the materials and the school buses and all the things that white parents could take for granted that their children would have. So in their additive model, Black children would have it all, right? They'd have climates that work for them. They would have people advocating for them, and they would have access to everything that white kids had access to. Now, what Dr. Tate was warning us in 1970, when he talked about a second-class integration, was that on the ground, this is not what we were getting. On the ground, what Dr. Tate saw, and we can now easily document, was that the teachers and the principals who knew how to create these schools were either being demoted, as happened to Mr. Halls, or fired. We lost somewhere between 30 and 50,000 Black teachers in this moment when Dr. Tate is railing about a second-class integration. They were intentionally fired while white teachers were hired. So if you fire the people who know how to create the climate and you get rid of their schools, which we now also know that most Black schools were either converted into some other kind of building, or they were demoted. So a high school now becomes an elementary school. And we certainly are not going to have Black principals of high schools. In North Carolina, the number of high school Black principals went from 103 to 3. I think I got those numbers right. I know it wound up with 3. So if you fire the people who know how to create the schools, who know how to teach the children, and get rid of the schools, then how do you help Black children aspire? Dr. Tate's office in real time was getting information from across the state of Georgia about the ways Black children were being treated in schools, in desegregated schools, the ways in which they were being over-disciplined, reproved because of how they were wearing their hair, any number of instances. And so this notion that our children will be in a caring climate, Dr. Tate sees is not happening in integration, desegregation. The advocacy that Dr. Tate ran through GT&EA, the Georgia Teachers and Education Association that he led, the Black Teachers Association. Well, in this moment, the National Education Association wants a merger of the Black associations and the white associations. For Georgia, that'd be GT&EA and GEA, the former white association. It is to become what we now know as GAE, the Georgia Association of Educators. But here's the problem. During the merger, NEA wants the Black and white educators to come together, but NEA is not committed to how they come together. So in other words, the ways in which GT&EA had looked out for, protected the interests of Black children, well, that would not be part of the merged association. So you can put people together, but in putting them together, GAE takes on more of the attributes of the former GEA, the white association, than it does GT&EA, which means the advocacy that allow Black educators to work with Black communities to protect Black children is lost. What Black educators were getting in real time that Dr. Tate understood was an exchange formula, not an additive formula. In other words, they were going to give up their understanding about schools and aspiration. They were going to give up their advocacy in exchange for access. And in 1970, Black children are being given access to white schools. Why does Dr. Tate rail against it and call it a second-class integration? Because we didn't get full access even then, particularly if you consider the ways in which the children were resegregated within the school building. What Dr. Tate understood in 1970 is that what the children were being given was not the additive model he and other Black educators wanted, but an exchange model that would not serve them well over time. It was a second-class integration. That's what Dr. Tate understood in 1970. He understood that the kids needed access, yes, but they need more than access. Now, if we were to take Mr. Hunt's notion, right, of the history living in the present, does that matter to us today? Is it just Dr. Tate and his historical moment? And so that's nice, we're glad you had the vision. Or does it mean something for us today? And I think it does. If we look at where the children are, I think Dr. Tate and those Black educators have hit upon exactly the formula that we need to put back in place as we consider how to help our children. I was just listening to a special where former President Obama was talking about his work with Black boys in Chicago. And one of the boys, young men, was talking about he just wished school could be a safe place. Wow, that's not new, right? He just wished he could go and develop his talents, the things he was interested in. Well, the truth of the matter is we knew how to do this. They call it the aspiration. We understood that children don't just need a curriculum, they need to believe in themselves. They need to believe that they can be full participants in this democracy. Our educators understood how to do that. And I think we've got to figure out how to pull that back when we critique, if you will, what's happening in the schools in which they are being educated today. It seems to me that thinking about aspiration is important. It can't just be about access. Although, if you were to be a part of national conversations, the big push, literally before Congress right now, is to get back to more access. They want to go back to 1970. I think that access is fine, but Dr. Tate shows us it's more than just access. We've got to do something else in the climate in which the children are being educated. And that's about aspiration, and that's about who teaches and how they teach and what the school climate looks like. Dr. Tate will remind us we also need advocates. We've lost our connection where people in higher ed are actually deeply connected with people in local communities. We've lost that. It's not that it doesn't exist anywhere. It's just that it doesn't exist in the network way that it did in the past. But educators can't get anything done without communities. We have to work in tandem. So I'm suggesting that when we think about Dr. Tate in history, when it relates to schools, he also gives us a map for the present. It's Mr. Hunt, right? We don't let the history live in the past, but we let it speak to the present. The second piece is civic engagement, and I'll try to make this a little shorter than I did the other. I'm sure all of you watched, as I did, on January the 6th with horror as America turned against itself in the Capitol uprisings. I don't think I would be remiss if I say most of us understand that America is in danger. Our democracy is in danger, in part because of the ways in which we really don't understand each other. Now, we're not the first generation that this happened to. Of course, Dr. Tate was a part of that segregated era when people had to figure out how to make democracy work. So when Dr. Tate is a young principal in Elberton, not in Elberton, in Greensboro, what does he do? What does he do when America is turned against itself and it doesn't want to provide democracy for all citizens? Dr. Tate begins a civics club. He's a principal. He can't let it be known publicly and widely what he's doing. So the men meet over at the church in the afternoon, and he provides the script for how they need to advocate in the community for change, to get better things in the schools, to get the things that children needed. I have actually looked at the civics sheet that they used when they taught the classes to the citizens in communities. They had, to be honest, I couldn't have answered all the questions that are on that sheet. It was a detailed overview of how American democracy is supposed to work. And it made sure that when these Black people went to register, they could answer any questions that somebody threw at them to keep them from being registered. It's an interesting kind of community preparation for civics engagement. Now, they do this, and at a time when Georgia is now opening the rolls up, right? We think about the voter registration drives in the 1960s, but this was the 1940s. What Dr. Tate and the men in the Civic Engagement Club are able to do is change the number of Black registered voters from 10 to 1,300. He made the Black community in Greensboro a force to be reckoned with. Now, white citizens are terrified because these Black people voting get a more moderate governor. And not only that, they now have the power to vote the funds to get their Black school rebuilt. It was an interesting moment of power in Greensboro, Georgia in the 1940s. Now, he's going to go on and do this in other places and in other ways that I don't have time to talk about today. But I want to share the response. Eugene Talmadge, Georgia's infamous governor, comes into Greensboro, says, "This is terrible. We need to purge the voter registration list, check on these people, see where they live, who's eligible to vote and who's not." Intimidation tactics. Wow. That sounds familiar today. Does Dr. Tate's civic work in the community matter for us now? I think knowing that history may matter. Dr. Tate's story shows us that it's ordinary citizens, people working together, who figure out how to organize their community in concert with other communities, and that people can actually make a change. We could forget about it, the civics part, and just say, oh, well, let's just focus on our children. But the children do need somewhere to live, right, when they grow up. So protecting America is also protecting our children. So that's the kind of living history I wanted to point out in the time we had today. This idea that Dr. Tate's book is nice, I hope, but it should be a living history, an understanding of where we can go. It should map us for the possibilities for our own actions and our own generation. That's the essence, right, of a Juneteenth celebration, not just looking backwards. We should look backwards. I was in Ghana a few years ago, and to see the slave castles that was probably one of the most horrifying experiences of my life. I never imagined how awful it was before they ever even got on the boat to come over here and do the Middle Passage and then be enslaved. So we honor those of our ancestors and what they went through, and we are grateful for their release. But Juneteenth clearly can't just be an opportunity to honor their release if we, their descendants, don't think about how to make things better for our generation of Black children and the generations to come. Dr. Bond, the person who was the president when Dr. Tate was at Fort Valley, and Dr. Tate was actually his student chauffeur, was mentored by Dr. Bond. Dr. Bond used to say that Black children were victims of colossal wickedness. He said that back in the 40s. And I think in many ways it's still true. So if we take Juneteenth and we take Dr. Tate and we think about how to celebrate him, do we just clap for what he did, or do we think about the script that he leaves us for what we could do? How will we respond? Will we, like Dr. Tate, decide it's important to help our people? Dr. Tate came back to Elberton after he was in Fort Valley. He did not have a job. Apparently, he was enjoying being home back at Elberton doing nothing. And his mother was like, "You got a job?" Okay. And she was not happy when he didn't. So she insisted that he get a job, which he reluctantly did. And when he came back to talk to his mother, he now is employed. He has a little money. And so he says to his mother, "Mom, what can I do for you?" He thought she would respond by saying, "Oh, I want to go to New York and visit my sons, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. I need some money, I need whatever." And Mrs. Tate in Elberton, Georgia, said something to her son that resonates for me today. She said, "Help our people. Help our people." That's the mandate she gave Dr. Tate before he would become the Dr. Tate that we would know about and write about, and now so many people would be reading about it. Help our people. He remembered that until he died, what his mother told him. Help our people. And I think Dr. Tate, if he were able to speak for himself today, would remind us that our generation also has a responsibility to help our people. Now, how you'll do that in Elberton, I don't know. I don't know. But I hope that this small amount of time that we've had together will inspire you to begin to do something to help our people. Thank you again so very much. Thank you for the opportunity to come virtually to Elberton. And I actually hope I have an opportunity to come back to Elberton in person. With thanks to all of you and hopes that the celebration goes very well.
What would you say to the children of Elberton and Elbert County today? Do you have any message of inspiration or hope for current and future generations of youth in this community?
Dr. Tate took so many of his cues from his mother and his father. In a time of segregation, he learned from his mother that it was okay to challenge the truth intellectually. That because folk are out there acting crazy, doesn't mean you have to accept that, but that you can look in yourself to be whoever you want to be. His mother taught him that. His father also taught him how to resist oppression, right? When the policeman came to get his brother in Elberton, Georgia, Dr. Tate was behind, I don't know, some door somewhere peeping. And he saw his father say, "My son did not do this, and you're not coming in here and get my son." And when the policeman said, "Yes, we are," he said, "You may come in, but you will not go out." That's pretty bold, right? Okay, in the 1930s. But his son was not taken out. His parents modeled for him a resilience that taught him something different than what the larger world was showing him. And he was, of course, was also learning with teachers and principals. I would encourage the children of Elberton to look to the larger Black community, and there are whites as well, people who love them, who have their best interests at heart, who they can look at and see what they can become. So to the children of Elberton, if Dr. Tate could make his way out and go on to do all the wonderful things that he did, when it was straight up segregation, because he had a community that insulated him and taught him he was gifted, then don't imagine that God quit giving out gifts when he gave them out to Dr. Tate's generation. You all are as gifted and as smart and have as much potential as any generation before you. And you don't let anybody tell you anything different. You look to the people who love you. You look in their eyes, see what they say your potential is, and then you do that.